So good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Ashley Jones. I'm D&I program manager here at F5. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Julissa Arce. So for those of you that don't know, Julissa Arce is a Latinx American bestselling author of My Underground American Dream and the book Someone Like Me. She is co-founder of Ascend Educational Fund and a leading voice in the fights for social justice, immigrant rights, and education equality. Julissa contributes to Time, Buzzfeed News, Crooked Media, CNBC, is one of the hosts of Crooked Conversations. Her book, My Underground American Dream, is currently being developed as a television series with producer and actor America Ferrera. She was named one of People in Español's 25 most powerful women in 2017, and in 2019, Woman of the Year by City of Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking conversation with Julissa upon the recent release of her third book, You Sound Like a White Girl. Welcome, Julissa. We are so excited to have you here today. You just wrote this new book. I read it from the front to the back. Absolutely love it. Can you tell us what inspired you to write You Sound Like a White Girl?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me today. And thank you to all of you who are tuning in and spending this time in community with us. So this book, it's my third book, and it is a little bit of a departure from my first two books, which were memoirs. The book that you mentioned, My Underground American Dream, and the young adult version of that, which is called Someone Like Me. And both of those books were my personal story, my journey of coming to the United States from Mexico and being an undocumented immigrant for some time in the United States. And that sort of tells that journey. Where You Sound Like a White Girl, I wanted to take a little bit of a zooming out, taking a step back and seeing how these experiences that I've had with assimilation are sort of deeply rooted in history, how there's sort of structural reasons why these things happen. The title of the book was inspired by this boy I had a crush on when I was in high school, and he told me that I sounded like a white girl. And in that moment, I took it as a compliment, because I had spent years trying to get rid of my accent. I spent years sort of practicing my English and enunciating words in a way that did reflect the way that many of the white girls in my school spoke, that reflected the way that white girls in movies, the way that they spoke. Because anytime that I imagined someone who was all American, like an all American cheerleader, the picture that was in my mind was someone who was blonde and someone who I'd seen in, all of these cheerleading movies. And so in that moment when he said that, I took it as a compliment. And it wasn't until later that I realized that this idea of assimilating, of trying to make myself into something that I'm not, was very harmful, not just to myself, but to my community. And, later on, that phrase, you sound like a white girl, was also a phrase that was used against me in my own community, where people would say, you sound like a white girl, you're not Mexican enough, so then this phrase is sort of a double-edged sword that really, for me, encapsulates the damage of assimilation, because it both leaves us not quite reaching belonging in America, and at the same time, it takes us away and it tears us apart from our own culture, from our own heritage, from our own language, from our own community. And so, this book is really about tearing down those lies of assimilation. And then the second part of the book is all about reclaiming. How did I put myself back together? How did I relearn, not so much relearn, but how did I learn history of my people in this country that is very often left out of the history of America, to the detriment of, frankly, all Americans, because we're all learning a story of the United States that it's incomplete.
Yes. Definitely. I mean, I agree with everything you said, and especially like, we're even seeing it in the chat. Um, you're not Hispanic enough, you're not Mexican enough, or you look like a white girl, or you sound like a white girl, and or you don't look Hispanic, or you don't look Latinx. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, what is it supposed to look like? Or what is it supposed to
Right.
sound like, right?
Exactly.
It's so funny to me. Um, you did hit on, you've got these three different myths in the book, there's three lies, and you start with the lie of English. And you did hit on it a little bit in terms of you had this crush. You said you sounded like a white girl. You took that as a compliment. But you also say that it gave you this false sense of security because if you have an accent, you're from somewhere else, right? And you say in your book that this idea of thinking was meant to tame you. What did you mean when you said tame? Like, what did that mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, so maybe it's helpful to sort of define assimilation, right? And what
Yes.
assimilation has meant to me. So I give this analogy in the book of a snake, right? And the snake sheds its skin, and it sheds that skin in order to grow and to heal, and to continue to exist. But at the core, it remains a snake. It continues to be a snake no matter how many times it sheds its skin. Assimilation, I feel, is the opposite of that. Assimilation asks us to shed our heritage, to shed our culture. It almost makes us ashamed of that culture. It makes us feel as though our culture is somehow inferior, and therefore we must let it go in order to assimilate into whiteness, in order to have proximity to whiteness, in order to belong in white spaces. And the reality is, as I mentioned earlier, is that in my experience, and historically speaking as well, which I talk a lot about in the book, that has never worked out for Mexicans, for people of color. It's never really given us belonging. But what it has done, it has tamed us. It has made us sort of get in line, right? Sort of stay in this sort of in this line of trying to be something that we are not. And that's what I mean by tame. Like, I think that it by assimilating, we are making ourselves small, because assimilation doesn't quite allow us to expand. In the second half of the book, I talk about with English, for example, right? English was sort of beat out of us in the 20s and 30s and 40s and in later decades. Schools in California and Texas were segregated by the Mexican schools and the white schools, and very often English was used as the excuse, as the reason why this Mexican children had to be segregated, even though in later court cases it was found that most of the time assignments were made by a student's last name. So if you had a Spanish sounding last name, you went to the Mexican school, even if you spoke English. And so, it sort of, English has been used to segregate us, to deport us, to really inflict pain in our community. And I think if instead we viewed speaking multiple language as an asset when we speak it also, then assimilation wouldn't feel like taming. Assimilation would allow us to expand, right? To take with us the parts that are ours, and also be able to take part in other cultures, in sort of the whatever we normally think of the American mainstream. Although I'm really trying to get away from that language, because I think when we say that there is such a thing as a mainstream, that there is such a thing as like a single identity of America, I think we get into sort of this into this kind of back to assimilation, right? Kind of trying to say this is the center of what we should aspire to be. And so that's what I mean about taming. Like, I think that if we were able to learn how to speak English, but also encouraged to keep our Spanish,
Yes.
or whatever other second language we speak, that would be a beautiful thing. That would really make us, it would encourage us to want to be part of this instead of resenting it.
Yeah, definitely. And that it's so true in so many households. You know, my grandparents they went through the struggles that you described. You know, they started school only speaking English and definitely were reprimanded for it. And therefore, you know, didn't want the rest of us to know Spanish. And so here I feel like at a deficit, you know, sometimes not relating to my culture because I feel like I don't fit in. I don't speak Spanish. And it's funny because you tell somebody, yes, you know, I'm Hispanic, and they say, well, do you speak Spanish? You know, it's one of those things.
And that also, I mean, I also push back against that idea in the book, right? Because just like there's not one way to be American, there isn't one way to be Latino, Latina, because Spanish cannot be the measuring stick for embracing our Latinidad. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand, you know, why so many Latinos don't speak Spanish, which a lot of people don't speak Spanish because exactly what you mentioned. Schools would physically punish kids for speaking Spanish. People, like I said, could get deported. I say in the book, I gave this example in the book of these two women who were speaking Spanish in Montana. This is in the last few years, and Border Patrol tried to detain them because they were speaking Spanish, even though they were U.S. citizens, right? And very sadly, the woman's child, that one of the women said that her daughter doesn't want to speak Spanish anymore because she's afraid, right? She said she saw what happened to her mom. And so there are real reasons why people sometimes don't embrace their Spanish. And to me, it's very sad that we live in a country where that can happen sometimes, right? Where there's people who view speaking Spanish as signaling that you're not from here, that you belong somewhere else. And, you know, I just think that we sort of need to reframe both that speaking Spanish is not the only way to be Latino. You can absolutely be Latino 100% and not speak Spanish, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and also be proud to speak Spanglish. Like, you know, at home, that's what I heard. You know, we get English and Spanish all together, and I think that's beautiful too. I think that's absolutely okay. So you also talk about the lie of success in your book. And this is a big one for me because, you know, you are very successful early on in your career. And, you know, you say, I wish I had realized sooner that no matter how hard I worked, how much success I achieved, or how many dollars I amassed in my bank account, belonging in a white world was not a dividend that came along with it. And I mean, it gives me chills just to say it because, you know, for those of you listening that don't know, Julissa at 27 was the VP at Goldman Sachs on Wall Street. And so I would love for you to walk us through that journey and tell us what it was like to be on Wall Street, especially as a Latina, and, you know, everything that you had to endure and then getting that so young and early in your career.
Yeah. So I always like to start with why I was drawn to go work on Wall Street, right? I was a sophomore in college when I saw a poster on campus that said that I could make $10,000 interning on Wall Street for 10 weeks. And I thought, oh my God, $10,000, that is more money than I can imagine. What is Wall Street? I need to find out what Wall Street is, and I need to go work there. Like, I made it my goal to learn everything I knew. I changed my major from marketing to finance. And I applied to an internship my sophomore year, didn't get it. I applied again my junior year, was able to get an internship working at Goldman Sachs. And really what drove me, as I mentioned, was sort of the money, right? I could make so much money working on Wall Street. And it wasn't about the money, really. It was about the things that I could do with that money. It was about the fact that I was financially responsible. I've been financially responsible for my family since I was 18 years old. I had to take care of my mom. She had a really terrible accident, had brain surgery, had to go through a lot of things. And my family moved back to Mexico when I started college so that my extended family in Mexico could help take care of my mom. And I stayed behind and I had to make money to send back home to help my mom. And so, I think that for a lot of us in communities of color, Latinos, there is sort of this responsibility to take care of our parents, which I think it's a beautiful thing. And I'll come back to how it can also be a really heavy load to carry. So in the back of my mind was always, how do I make the most money so I could help my family, right? I didn't have the luxury to really ask myself, what am I interested in? What do I really want to do with my life? Like, that was not a question, a conversation I had with myself. The conversation I had with myself was, where can I go make the most money? And it just so happened that once I started working on Wall Street, I actually really enjoyed it. I've always really liked math. When I didn't know how to speak English, math was that thing that sort of kept me feeling sane, because numbers are numbers in English and in Spanish. And so I was good at my job. I enjoyed it. It was not the learning curve or the amount of hours that I worked that were difficult. And you do work a lot. My first year as an analyst, I was working 80, 100-hour work weeks. I worked every single weekend. It was not uncommon to be in the office till 2 o'clock in the morning and back at 7 a.m. That was normal. That was sort of the culture on Wall Street, was to work that much your first few years. So that part wasn't hard, because I sold funnel cakes in college, and I would take a Greyhound bus and go to San Antonio from Austin every weekend and sell funnel cakes. And so to me, hard work was like not hard. I was used to it. I knew what hard work was. To me, I was like, I get to sit in an office and it's air conditioned and I don't have to be, I'm not getting burned from the fryer later. Like, this is great. So that part wasn't hard. The learning curve, it was steep, and I had to learn a lot of things very quickly. But I knew that if I spent enough time learning the concepts, I would get them. Even if it took me longer to get them, I would get there. And I did. So those two things were not hard. What made it really difficult to fit in to a place like Wall Street and be successful in a place like Wall Street, and I think as an extension in corporate America, was the culture. How different my socioeconomic upbringing had been from that of my colleagues, right? I did not grow up going skiing to Aspen. I did not grow up going on vacations to Europe in the summer with my parents. Those things were so foreign to me. And I felt so out of place, and like I couldn't take part in those conversations. And I was over here like buying clothes at like the Gap and Target while my colleagues were shopping, they were wearing Chanel suits. And I always used to think, like, how can they afford this? Because your first year, you're not making that much money. And then I realized, a lot of my colleagues were living in their parents' spare Manhattan apartment, or they had their parents' credit cards to sort of finance their wardrobe, which those things were important, like how you dressed, what purse you carried, what shoes you wore, like all of those things signaled that you belonged in this world. And I didn't have those things. So that part was the most challenging. And, I had experiences like walking into a conference room to meet with a client, and the client asked me to bring him coffee while he waited for the vice president. And I was the vice president he was waiting for, but he thought I was the assistant. And so I had experiences like that led me to write that sentence that you read from the book, which is, I had all of the things that I thought I needed to belong. I had a really prestigious job. I eventually was making a ton of money working on Wall Street. I was wearing the clothes, I was doing all the things, and yet I still had experiences like the one I just mentioned, which really to me felt like, if I'm gonna make money, if I'm gonna try to be successful, I'm gonna do it for me, not because I think that that's gonna somehow magically help me to belong in these spaces, because many times it doesn't. I think that there's a really big difference between diversity and inclusion. Like, you can have a very diverse group of people, but if those people still don't feel included, then diversity isn't enough. Just having and hiring different groups of people is not enough when they have to change everything about themselves in order to fit into the corporate culture. To me, that's counterintuitive, because it's I think what's really needed is we need to pull away from and pull back from even some of the language that we use about inclusion and diversity, because I think that still very much centers whiteness, because we're saying we're diverse in relation to this thing. We are going to be included into these tables, but it's always assumed that those spaces are white and the rest of us are trying to belong in these white spaces. And so I think we need to rethink how we talk about and how we implement diversity and inclusion in our companies.
Yes, totally agree with you. And being part of the D&I team here at F5, that is something that we really try to focus on, is the inclusive piece of it. Because like you said, it doesn't matter, if you might see some others that you identify with that feel brown too, if you don't feel like you're all being accepted or being brought into the inner circle or carried along, or people meeting you where you're at. And those are some of the really important things that, help you in your career and make you feel like, you should be here and you are important and you can do this. So I definitely appreciate you saying that, for sure. Okay, I'm just going to get into it right now. I'm going to get a little controversial here because, you hear this a lot, and I think let's just go there. You often are asked why you didn't fix your immigration status when your visa expired. And you have this line in your book, and I love it. It says, but if we just did it the right way, and if we just get in that mythical line, America would welcome us with open arms, or so they say. Can you share with us your personal experience of becoming an American citizen?
Yeah, and it's funny that you said we're just now going to get controversial, because I was just taking a little look at the chat, and it sounds like we've already gotten controversial.
We have, but I'm trying not to get too distracted.
I love the side conversation that is happening in the chat, because so much of me writing this book is about starting conversations, and I think that people will disagree with some of the things that I write about in the book, and that's okay, because this is one perspective, but I hope that after people do read the book, that even if they disagree with me, they'll understand why I am writing the things that I'm writing. But to your question about, immigration. So I came to the US when I was 11 years old. And when I was 14, my visa expired. And I became one of the 11 million undocumented people living in the United States. And I overstayed my visa, which is something that is often missed in discussions about undocumented immigrants, which is that, we normally tend to focus, when we think undocumented immigrant, we focus on the Mexico-US border, we focus on people who cross the border, even though about 40 to 50% of undocumented people are visa overstayers, like myself. And we're not all Mexican, we're all not Latino. The fastest growing group of immigrants in the United States is it's Asians, and so this conversation about immigration is much bigger than what we make it out to be. But yes, I often was asked, because I was undocumented for like 15 years, including some of the years that I worked at Goldman. And people would just often ask me, like, why didn't you fix your immigration sooner? Like, I think sometimes people think that I was being lazy, or I didn't want to fill out the application or pay the fines. And that's just not true, because the reason I didn't fix my immigration status is because there was no way for me to fix my immigration status. Very often we talk about the line and people getting in the back of the line and waiting their turn, except that that line doesn't exist. That line is a mythical line. There is no way for many undocumented people to fix their immigration status. I only became eligible to adjust my status because my husband is a U.S. citizen, and so because he's a U.S. citizen, then I was able to become a citizen through him. And even that is very unfair, because had I crossed the border illegally, even if I had married a US citizen, I would still not be eligible to fix my immigration status, because that's how the current laws of the United States are structured. And it's been, almost 40 years since we've had any kind of immigration reform. And so when we say people should get in the back of the line, what we're really saying is that there should be immigration reform so that we can create that line, we can create that process for people to fix their immigration status, because currently there is none. There is no way. And when people tell me, well, my parents, they came the right way, or I have a cousin, or I have a friend who came the right way, I often like to ask those people, where did those people immigrate from? And also, what is their socioeconomic status in the places that they immigrated from? Because even to get a tourist visa to come to the United States, you have to show that you have assets, that you have property from places like Mexico, right? If you're trying to get a tourist visa from a place like Mexico, you pretty much have to be wealthy to get that visa, where people from Europe can come on with a European passport, can come without a visa many times. And so what all of that really shows me is that where people come from makes a huge difference for who is accepted and admitted. We're seeing it play out right now with what's happening in Ukraine. The way that we're treating Ukrainian refugees, we should absolutely, in my opinion, welcome them. And also the way that we're treating them should be the way that we treat Central American asylum seekers, Haitian asylum seekers, because there's a very big double standard for how we treat immigrants depending on where they come from.
Yeah. Yeah. And, part of what you just said, ironically, because you married your husband, you were able to adjust your status. And so, how do you respond to people that believe you and your husband's relationship is not real? Or, you did it just so you could adjust your status?
Yeah. Nowadays, honestly, when people think that or ask that, I don't even have the energy, nor do I want to spend the time like answering such a ridiculous question, because it's like if those people who ask me that question ever had to go through the process that we had to go through, I mean, that would be quite a thing to have to put to try to, first of all, we had dated for many years before we even got married, right? We had to prove that we had been in a relationship. We had to show joint bank accounts. We had to show proof that we're living together. We had to go through so many interviews and background checks. Like, it's not like you get married and when you sign your marriage license, a green card like magically appears. It's still a years long process that you have to go through. It certainly is not an easy process. It's a very expensive process. I often think, like, how does sort of how do people go through this that don't have the resources that I had? Because just like a retainer from a lawyer, it's like $5,000 as an initial retainer. So we don't make it easy at all for people to adjust their status, even when there are very narrow pathways to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. And so this kind of brings me on to, because we're talking about immigration, changing the immigration system, and all these changes that should be implemented and that need to come. And this kind of brings me a little bit towards the end of your book, because in the end of your book, you talk about creating new spaces and new systems, new rules, things to bring us together. You have this line in the book. My wish is that more people will learn about the beautiful, authentic, and respectful ways in which we have come together. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there is this whole section where you talk about the Brown community coming together a lot and making change, and change for, one is change for all, right? And so that I would just love for you to share a little bit about that with all of us.
Yeah, so the book has a lot of history to really, so that this isn't just like my experience, right? My personal experience. There is historical record of how these things have shown up in, as I mentioned at the beginning, systemic ways. But one of the things that was really, there's a lot of difficult history that I share in the book, because our people, my people in this country, have gone through so much. They have endured so much, and much of that we never learn about in school. This is not history that is ever included. But the other part of the history that I learned about, that I was so inspired by, that I wished so deeply in my heart that I had known when I was growing up, because it would have helped me to understand just how much I belong in this country. I also never learned in school. I talk about these cheerleaders in Texas who, they were these young girls, 15, 17-year-old girls in Crystal City, Texas in 1968. And their school had a rule that only one of the 4 cheerleaders could be Mexican American, even though the school was 85% Mexican American. And these young girls, like, they fought for the right to bear pom-poms. And they organized student walkouts for 17 days. They were able to overturn that rule. They were able to have Mexican food in the cafeteria be served, because before that, Mexican food was not allowed in the cafeteria.
Wow.
They would be struck if they spoke Spanish in the hallways. And they were able to create this incredible change, not just in their school, but within 2 years, the school council and the school board became majority Latino, because they really energized their community to stand up for themselves. And I was so inspired by them. I was so inspired in the ways in which Black and Brown leaders in the 60s and 70s worked together. And I think sometimes we don't learn about those things. And I think it's purposeful that those things are left out, because if we knew how we have come together in the past, and while there are tensions that exist, and that's not to minimize the tensions that exist amongst different communities, we have also come together in very beautiful ways to advocate for our collective freedom. And to me, learning about that has been really inspiring, both in learning of that history, but also of what we can learn from that history, and how we can learn from the beautiful ways in which we came together, and also learn from the mistakes that were made in the past, so that we can create and build stronger coalitions, so that we truly can be intersectionals in our fight for freedom and for equality.
Yeah. And I heard you, like you just said, there in your book, there's a lot of history pieces in it, which, like you said, it's not taught in school. In fact, when I was reading it, I was actually a little embarrassed that some of these pieces I really didn't even know. What do you think in the book are some of those really outstanding pieces that we may not know, that our readers might not know, that you did so much research for this book? Like, what are some of those pieces that are that are left out in the school systems that should not be, that we should know more about?
Yeah, I mean, I shared some of it, some of it now, and I have sort of already been sharing, like the schools, how they were segregated, the school walkouts. There's a Chicano moratorium where 50,000 mostly Mexican Americans marched in East Los Angeles against the Vietnam War because, as a percentage of our population, Mexican Americans had the highest casualty rates in Vietnam. And yet, you have veterans who are deported all the time, people who served the country who still get deported. And so what I tried to do with this history is to say that this history is still alive. This history didn't just stay in the past. This history very much shows up in various ways today, because history doesn't just tell us of the past, it really informs our present, and in many ways shapes our future. And if we don't know this history, how can we truly be aware of how deep these issues are and also how to solve them, right? And that's why I continue to say that I think it's very purposeful that this history is not included, because imagine if we knew this history when we were growing up, when we were 12, 13, 15 years old, learning about all of these things. If we saw ourselves reflected in that history, we would be so much more empowered, and we would demand more. We would know that we're right to demand more and to want more.
And speaking of demanding and wanting more, what would be your advice for the brown community in a corporate world, identifying as Latina in a corporate environment, or just what is your resounding advice for us, and how we continue to carve the way for those behind us, and continue to lean in and do great things wherever we're at?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this about the book, which is, the book is not prescriptive. The book is not a how-to book. It's not a book that says, do these 10 things so that you can reclaim your culture. It's not that. And I think the reason I didn't want to do that is because so much of this is personal, and so much of this is about your own experiences and how your own experiences change and shift your perspective. And so to me, the biggest advice I can give is to explore, to learn about our history. There is, in the notes section of my book, there are many historical texts that I hope that people will read. I hope that when people are reading You Sound Like a White Girl, they will take out a highlighter or a pencil and make notes and have conversations with friends, have conversations with colleagues and family, because I think that the more that we have conversations, the better. And there are different perspectives. I think somebody took issue with me saying that it's perfectly fine if you don't speak Spanish. I want my children to speak Spanish. I want to teach my children to speak Spanish. I also don't think that if you don't speak Spanish, that means that you are somehow less Latino, less Mexican, or that you don't care. There are structural reasons why we don't learn to speak Spanish. And it's very difficult to learn a second language. And so I try to be very tender about not judging others for not speaking Spanish, in the same way that I try to be tender about the fact that my parents, even though they spent 20 years in the United States, never learned to speak English fluently. But the best sort of advice that I can give is to keep an open mind, listen to one another, and for us to try to come to solutions together.
Yeah. Well, and like you just said, solutions together. I would love to kind of full circle wrap this up. And what do you think is the next step for creating these new spaces and coming together and continuing on a path for justice for all?
Sorry, can you, what do I?
What do you think is our next step? Because for creating these new spaces and appreciating the ways that we've worked together in the past, what do you think we all need to do as our next step to continue down that path of justice for all?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it I mentioned, which is, I really think that holding spaces like this, right? Holding spaces for you guys to share stories and to share perspectives, like these things are very helpful, I think, and very meaningful and can be very impactful. I think that we can assert our identities in small and big ways. I think that the more that we carry our full entire selves when we go to work, the more that we'll create spaces. I remember when I worked on Wall Street, literally leaving pieces of myself at home in order to walk into the office, right? Whether it was big hoop earrings that I felt were not professional. And I always think, like, who said pearls were professional and hoop earrings are not? Like, who made that rule, and we need to change it. Things like, even like the way I'm wearing my nails right now, like these nails are very cultural. Like this color, these flowers, they have meaning, and I'm carrying my culture on my body. Where when I worked on Wall Street, I would have never been able to have my nails like this. People would have commented on them. They would have looked side-eyed them. And so I think that if we can bring our full selves everywhere we go, we inevitably will make rooms more expansive to hold all of us, instead of shrinking ourselves to fit into these spaces. We have to just break free and bring our full entire selves to truly create, I think, a fairer, better world.
Yes. And you're so right about the hoop earrings. I love hoop earrings. I'm like, I can maybe count the times on my hand, like one hand, that I've actually worn like hoop earrings to work, because I like, the big giant ones, right? So I just have to say, this has been amazing getting to speak with you today. For those of you who don't know, Julissa's book is out. It was released on March 22nd. It's amazing. It's a really good read. If you have the time, please go get it. It's a really good read, like I said. Julissa, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for teaching. Thank you for just being you. I'm fangirling so hard right now, because you have just paved the way for so many of us, and you just have so much to offer, and I just can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for spending the time with me. And I was trying to kind of look at the chat but not look at it, because I didn't want to get distracted.
I know.
But I'm inspired by the conversations that are happening already.
I know.
And I'm really curious to see where they all go. And yes, the best way to support my work is to get my book. And you don't, if you want to buy it, but you can also get it from your library. You can you can request it from your library if you don't want to have an actual book. But otherwise, you can buy it anywhere books are sold. And thank you so much for spending the time with me this morning.
No, thank you. And thank you for everybody joining and being brave to speak out and get into our chat. I think we covered everything that was in the chat, so we didn't miss too much.
Yes, we did not. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day and a great week.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.